we're going to now look at 2017 and try to make some sense of it. And I have to say, in all the years I've done this, there's more uncertainty going into this year than there has been at any other time. So let's look at some of the key political issues for 2017. I won't focus too much on the domestic issues regarding the Trump administration. You're well aware of those. Let's look at some of the global issues. Now, the abandonment of trade deals. We've already seen the Trump administration pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, Australia is leading an effort to try to keep the TPP alive without the United States in order that in 4 or 8 or 12 years' time, when there's another administration in power in Washington who's more favorable to the trade deal, that the United States could join. Other countries have expressed some pessimism about that. Japan says the TPP without the United States is worthless. Some of the Latin American countries involved have already moved to start making deals with China as an alternative to the TPP. So it remains to be seen if that very important trade deal has a life in the years ahead or if it now dies because the United States has pulled out of it. Climate change, another thing. We've seen the Trump administration sign the 2 pipeline deals recently, talking about pulling out of the Paris climate deal recently. Keep in mind, the Bush and the Obama administrations did a lot to bring China and India on board to these climate deals. And the old Kyoto Treaty didn't include the United States, of course, but also didn't include India and China. And that was a prerequisite of the previous administrations in the United States, that if we're going to do a deal, we want the big emerging markets to also be part of it, because where's the pollution going to grow? Of course, it's going to be in places like India and China. Now that the United States is potentially pulling out of those, the other emerging markets going to follow suit. It's very interesting to watch what will happen there. Another thing the last 2 administrations have done in the United States is support democratic reform around the world. Now, this hasn't always been successful, as we know. Iraq would be a perfect example of that. But nevertheless, there has been a consistent push from Washington, regardless of the party in power, for pushing for democratic reforms. Well, I don't think we're going to see that push from the Trump administration. And that's having a major impact around the world. Look at places like Thailand, where the military is currently running the country, or Malaysia, where the government is becoming increasingly authoritarian, or the Philippines. Has anyone seen that president from the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte? He makes Donald Trump look like a calm, reasoned, rational, stable person. He says things that are unbelievable, and he's launched this anti-drug campaign in the Philippines, and he just sends vigilante groups out to shoot someone who's suspected of taking drugs. They've killed over 6,000 people. He's bragged about throwing people out of helicopters himself as part of this. Well, he was the mayor of Davao City in the southern Philippines. So these are the type of things that previous administrations in the United States might have pushed back against. We don't know if we'll see that right now. Uncertainty over U.S. military alliances. This is a very big deal if you live in Europe or in East Asia, because they depend upon United States military support for their security. In Europe, there is a lot of fear, particularly in the eastern part of the region, that the United States is going to reduce its commitment to NATO. Now, listen, a lot of NATO countries have been doing less than they should in terms of spending on defense. I mean, some of them are spending less than 1% of their GDP on defense, whereas the NATO charter calls for 2% of GDP to be spent on defense. So maybe this wakes up a lot of our allies in Europe and forces them to do more. It remains to be seen. The same holds true in Asia, where a lot of countries are looking to the United States to be the balancer of power in that region because of China's rising dominance there. And then, of course, the potential serious rift in relations with China. We've seen a lot of rhetoric on both sides, from Washington and Beijing, regarding things like trade or the South China Sea. This is the world's most important bilateral relationship by far. So if we see a major deterioration in relations between the United States and China in the coming years, that's going to have major security and economic ramifications down the road. And look, without question, the United States has turned inward. We are now looking at a few years at least of a more insular United States. This has an impact around the world. Keep in mind, as I mentioned, the United States is the balancer of power in many parts of the world. In the Middle East, we've had many conflicts, but they haven't been state-on-state conflicts since the Iran-Iraq war. A smaller U.S. presence in the Middle East, for example, could lead to a huge increase in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran on one hand. Europe, of course, you know the role we play there. And East Asia, I just mentioned. And what's very important is that the United States is the guarantor of global trade. Our Navy protects the sea lanes around the world by which most global trade moves. The British Navy did that in the 19th century when it had a major increase in trade. The United States Navy has done that since the Second World War. if we start to lose that control, if the risk of piracy and the risk of conflict over trade lanes begins to grow, that's a major long-term threat to the global economy, which I think a lot of people have underestimated so far. Populism is rife in Europe right now, both on the far right and the far left. We see populist parties now in power in a number of countries, and we have some major elections coming up in Europe. Most of the key elections in the world in 2017 will take place in Europe, and populist parties, both on the right and the left, are going to do better than ever before, at least better than the period since the Second World War. If you're Russian President Vladimir Putin and you consider the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe to ever befall Russia, then 2017 is the year you've been waiting for. Because you have now an administration, well, I shouldn't say an administration, I should say a president in the United States who looks favorably at Russia, because a lot of the members of the administration have taken a pretty hard line against Russia, or at least Russian actions in recent years. You have a Europe that's quite divided. You have a lot of uncertainty in the regions around you. This is Russia's big chance, if they are going to attempt to grab it, to gain control or at least dominance over the countries around them. A lot of the countries of the former Soviet Union. We've seen what's happened in Ukraine in recent years. Russia's very involved now in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, trying to become more involved in Eastern Europe. So for President Putin, this is the year, if you're going to revive Russia into a great power once again, it's now or never. And that could lead to some conflicts around Russia's periphery in the coming years. And of course, the wars in the Middle East and North Africa, the one that's having a major impact in many other parts of the world right now is Libya. Libya is becoming the Somalia of the Mediterranean. There's no central government. The country's divided among rival militias and rival clans, and there's weapons everywhere because the civil war has been going on for some time now. That has led to this migration crisis. It's the second route for migrants after 2015, most of the migrants who went to Europe went through Turkey. Turkey closed the borders with Greece, if you will, but a lot of them now coming through Libya going to Italy. We saw almost 300,000 cross last year. That's not the million that crossed in 2015, but the potential for more of that in the coming years is very big. China has wasted no time in trying to fill the void left by a more isolationist United States. Days after the election of Donald Trump, China was talking about trade deals and investment deals all around the world. President Xi Jinping was traveling around Latin America a week or two after, signing deals everywhere he went. China is trying to is going to do whatever they can to protect global trade and investment because they need it, quite frankly. At the same time, they are now going to try and have a bigger role in setting international standards and international trade standards, economic standards, et cetera. That's going to be a challenge to the United States. That has been our job for a long time. And it remains to be seen if China is able to do that. China is not the economy that the United States is. It's still developing a middle-income economy. There's a number of flashpoints. I could put a map up there and put 50 stars on it with flashpoints, quite frankly, but those are just a couple that we're looking at this year. I mentioned Venezuela, of course. The situation there right now is extremely dire. A 19% collapse in the economy last year on top of a nearly 6% collapse the year before. Inflation out of control. That's the one that I'm watching closely at the moment. A lot of economic issues to get to. Global economic growth is not forecast to grow too much. We're looking at a little bit of a peak in the early part of next year, a lot of that being driven by our growth here in the United States. We're looking at growth accelerating here. But over the next couple of years, GDP growth, we're forecasting to be about 3.2, 3.3% for the world. That's going to make it 7 to 8 years of consecutive 3% or 3% plus growth. A long, long period of relatively sluggish growth. So who's contributing to the growth in 2017? That chart shows the percentage of growth that's coming from an individual country or an individual region. Well, China is accounting for about 22% of the growth next year. And the United States and Canada combined, I don't think we're going to build a wall with Canada. The United States and Canada are also going to be a key driver of growth this year. We're looking at relatively healthy growth in the United States. Canada's economy struggled a little bit. We'll talk about them later. But China, the United States, and Canada are the key drivers of growth going forward. What you see there is not much growth being driven by the other emerging markets. And a few years ago, you were deriving a lot of growth from the Middle East, from Brazil, from other parts of the world like that. There's not much growth right now coming from emerging markets. The threat of protectionism is the single greatest economic threat right now. If we start enacting or erecting trade barriers all around the world, we've seen what's happened in the past. The Great Depression in many ways was made much worse by protectionism. 19th century economic progress was consistently stifled by protectionist measures around the world. It remains a major threat. Our global economy is so intertwined right now. Imagine if you produce a car here in the United States, you probably source products from 40 different countries. And if you start to have barriers in place, if things start to become more convoluted in terms of your supply chain, that is a major threat to growth. I think it's been underestimated, but it's what we're hearing from a lot of our clients is that we are very concerned about what are the ramifications for our supply chain, because quite frankly, the pieces of our products come from everywhere right now. Over the near term, we're looking at a pickup in growth here in the United States. We're not looking at getting quite to 3%. We're looking at about 2.5, 2.6% over the next couple of years, which is better than where we've been for much of the past decade. The concern is if the Trump administration goes through with the tax cuts they're proposing and some of the other plans, it's going to have to boost growth to about 3.5 to 4% to make sure that debt and deficit levels don't rise accordingly. So if they're going to go through with these major tax cuts like they're talking about, they are going to have to generate growth, or else it's going to be a big failure. If the growth is generated, fine. We'll generate the additional tax revenues through growth. But if not, we're facing large increases in our deficit levels going forward over the longer term. We're looking at a little bit slower growth in Europe. No major crisis at the moment. There are a few threats. The Italian banking sector sticks out as one. They received a bailout a few weeks ago, but a lot of the banks in Italy are terribly sick. Keep in mind, these banks in Europe have been dealing with 0% interest rates, or in many cases negative interest rates for a long time. A lot of bad debts as well. So their financial health remains much worse than the banks here in the United States. That's a significant threat in Europe. But a weak euro we're predicting is going to offset some of the domestic weakness and help to keep growth positive, at least going forward. I haven't talked about Japan. Japan is now in its 25th year of stagnation. That is 25 years the Japanese economy has grown by an average of 0.8% per year. And a lot of that has to do with the fact the population is shrinking. They have the fastest shrinking population in the world. The Japanese population is forecast to shrink from its 127 million right now to like 101, 102 million by the middle of the century. So this is one of the most important economies in the world. In 1992, this was the wealthiest developed economy in the world, and it was almost as large as the US economy. And today, it's just in terminal decline, driven in large part by its demographic decline. And that's a story we're seeing all over the developed world. Population growth has slowed. It's slowed in Europe. Some European countries face a very similar situation. Japan, it's even slowed in most of what we call the New World economies, the United States, Canada, Australia. Those economies had the benefit for a long time. The birth rate was higher, immigration was higher, particularly skilled immigration. That's slowed in all of those economies as well. So we're looking at growth ceilings falling simply because of demographics. China is going to try to continue to manage its slowdown. I mean, the economy continues to slow. I mentioned the risks that are in place there, but as we've talked about since the beginning, China is in this process of moving away from being dependent upon manufactured exports and increasingly driven by consumer spending within China. And consumer spending has remained strong through this slowdown. It's been growing 10, 11, 12% per year in recent years. That's very impressive. The middle class in China is growing substantially. It's a question of, can they manage this rising debt crisis? Can they deal with overcapacity? If you're a number of industries you might be involved in China, there's a huge amount of overcapacity in a number of industries. India will remain the fastest growing large economy. We're looking at growth at about 8% per year in the coming years. Now that's not the 10% growth that China averaged for 30 years from 1980 to 2010, but it's still pretty impressive. If India wants to grow faster, it's going to need to develop a bigger manufacturing sector. But right now, if you look at China developed an export-oriented infrastructure very quickly. It was very cheap to produce, to build a product in a factory, get it to a port, and ship it out in China. It was very fast, very efficient, very cheap. That's not the case in India. If you do business in India, you know how difficult it is to produce there, how costly it is, how time-consuming it is. In China, if Beijing says, we're going to build this road in this port, you're going to build this road in this port. If New Delhi says it, well, the state government maybe doesn't like it. You might have communists in charge of the port town, and they're not going to invest in anything. And so it doesn't get done so easily. And that's why India is lagging substantially behind in the manufacturing sector, and why there hasn't been that much investment in the manufacturing sector as opposed to China. But the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi realizes this. They are trying to enact some pretty interesting reforms to attract investment, to develop the manufacturing sector. It remains to be seen if they'll be able to do that. I haven't talked about Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has 670 million people. It's a quite diverse market. It's also growing healthy, quite at a healthy pace. Altogether, if you take India, you take Southeast Asia, you take China, you're looking at 3 billion people in a region that is growing substantially. I mean, this is the region that's going to drive much of the growth in the coming decades. If you have a long-term growth strategy, you have to be focused on Asia. Outside of Asia, and those Mexican numbers have been revised down since this, I wonder why, since this presentation was first made. There's not much growth outside of Asia, and there hasn't been in recent years because of low commodity prices and because of low export competitiveness levels. For example, take Brazil, who's been in this terrible recession for the last 2 years. It's cheaper to build something in China and ship it to Brazil than it is often to build it in Brazil and sell it in Brazil. And that's a fact for many of these emerging markets outside of Asia, that they have not been able to develop that level of competitiveness. By competitiveness, I mean productivity, cost, access to the markets. They just have not been able to emulate what's been done in Asia. One of the key issues, and the key issue here in the United States, was bringing manufacturing jobs back. And I've had a number of interviews on that recently. The other key issue with manufacturing is who's going to replace China as the low-cost manufacturing hub. Those jobs aren't coming here. I mean, let's be realistic. If they do, it's going to be a fully automated factory. Nobody is hiring people here in the United States to do the low-cost, labor-intensive work that they're doing in parts of China and other emerging markets. It's unrealistic to suspect that. So who's going to replace it? Look at those numbers. China produces half the steel in the world today. Now there's some overcapacity. We're going to start to see steel production peak out in China. China, 25 years ago, China produced less cars than I think Cuyahoga County did. Today it produces twice as many cars as the United States. So this was this huge manufacturing shift to China, but where is this manufacturing going to go? China is losing its competitiveness. It's becoming expensive to produce in China. The yuan is strong. Labor costs are going up because the labor market is shrinking in the middle, and labor shortages are in place in many places in China now. So China is losing its competitiveness. Some of that manufacturing will come back here, on the high end particularly. I think you'll see an increase in some of that going back to developed economies. Unfortunately, it's not going to create that many jobs. It's going to be heavily automated. Take Adidas, for example. Adidas shoes is a very low-end production job. It's a very labor-intensive job. They've just built a factory back in Germany. It's not employing anybody except a few security guards. It's fully automated. They're going to produce shoes again in Germany. Imagine that. Germany is one of the most expensive countries that produce anything in the world. They're going to do it in Germany, but they're not hiring anybody to build the shoes in Germany. It's going to be fully automated. And that's the type of investment that you're going to see when you talk about manufacturing coming back home. A lot of it is going to be heavily automated. So other economic risks to watch. We talked about the dollar. A key one around the world is income inequality, and that's driving a lot of this populism that we see. The middle class in America, in Europe, even in some of the developed Asian economies, is shrinking and shrinking rapidly. The rich are getting richer. The poor are growing in size. It's a huge challenge. How do we deal with that? Because there's no apparent answer. The days of the massive factories and you can leave high school, get a great job for 45, 50 years, make a great living in a factory or something like that, are really disappearing. So how do we deal with income inequality? Redistributing wealth doesn't really work. European countries have tried that. Others have tried that. It hasn't worked. It's dragged the whole economy down. So we don't have a good answer for that yet. Low levels of confidence. That's not so much the case here in the United States right now. Consumers have been very confident. Businesses have become increasingly confident. They believe the new administration is going to facilitate business, whereas a lot of businesses saw the Obama administration as being a hindrance to business. And investor confidence. That's the other key category. I mentioned the Dow is over 20,000. Outside of the United States, these three levels of confidence are much lower. Business and investor confidence in particular is pretty weak in many key economies right now. Consumer confidence is middling at best. So while the United States is being driven by some very high levels of confidence in the economy at the moment, a lot of our key partners around the world, that's not the case.